Prime Minister Narendra Modi delivered an interesting long address in response to the debate on the president's speech recently concluded parliament session. Now, among the many things he said, some are now coming back as possible points for discussion. And one of those was the argument that he made about the Gandhi family, the Nehru Gandhi family, and their record on national security. That is because Rahul had attacked him on national security, particularly saying that it was his government's policies that had enabled or that had made it easier for Pakistan and China to come even closer to be a problem for India. He responded to that by saying that Gandhi family itself, he was very careful not to mention Indira Gandhi there because then Bangladesh, etc. come in. That's problematic. He sort of focused his attack on the Nehru era. And one of the things he complained about strongly was the Nehru government's record on the liberation of Goa. Now, India became independent in 1947, and we know that Goa was liberated by the Indian Armed Forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force in 1961. In fact, third week of December 1961, the operation started on 17th of December. It was over in about 26 hours when the Portuguese governor of Goa decided to surrender. In fact, he surrendered defying his high commands and his government's instructions. So Manuel Antonio Vassallo, the governor of Goa, he surrendered. In fact, he wrote a very emotional message to his troops and others saying, look, I speak as a patriot. We are outnumbered greatly. He had about 2,000 troops. Indian armed forces had sent about 30,000. And they were surrounded from all sides, including from the sea, because the Navy was there in strength. The airport at Dabolim had been bombed. The runway had been rendered unserviceable. So he said, I can't get any supplies. We can't fight. So I have decided to surrender. In fact, he surrendered that day. But the question is, why did it take 14 years for India to liberate Goa? For 14 years, Goa continued to be controlled by a foreign country. In fact, Goa was the last of the foreign colonies to be liberated in India. India had a bunch of colonies. Many European countries had colonies here. The French had Pondicherry and other colonies, Pondicherry, Karaikal and others, and some of those colonies had changed hands between European powers in the past. Dutch had colonies, they had Karaikal I think at some point. The Danes, when it was a combined joint Danish-Norwegian empire, they also had colonies on the Indian coast, notably what is called as Tranquebar or Tharangambadi. So all of these existed, all of these had cleared out earlier. In fact, Pondicherry, de facto merger of Pondicherry with India took place in about 1954, 1 November 1954, if I remember correctly. De jure was 1956 when the laws were passed in India. There was a lot of resistance to that in France also because there was always that colonial nostalgia. So the French Parliament only ratified it in April, I think, of 1962. The fact is that by about 1954, Pondicherry, the French had cleared out of Pondicherry. So why did it take India so long to get the Portuguese off our backs in Goa, or to get the Portuguese off the Goans' backs 14 years after India became independent? And in fact, 14 years after India had fought its first military war with the Pakistanis over Kashmir, the first war over Kashmir. Why did India wait that long? Now that's a question that will immediately make this generation wonder that, maybe Nehru was this hopeless pacifist. There were aspects of his foreign policy that were hopelessly pacifist, right? And we keep talking about them now and then. His failure on China is well known and well documented. To understand what happened in Goa and why it took 14 years and what exactly happened, we need to be a little patient and take a deep breath. And as we take a deep breath, we first of all remember the name Salazar. Now, Salazar was the leader, the strongman of Portugal. Salazar was the only, I would say, the only significant dictator, the only significant fascist dictator in Europe to survive the Second World War. And how did he do it? He was a smart guy. From mid-30s onwards, he began to disagree with Hitler's racist policies. He called them racist. He opposed the Nuremberg laws. He said, I am against all this. Now, ideologically, he was against socialism. That was one of the propositions of the Nazi party. He was also against communism. So while he disagreed with Hitler very strongly, he said at the same time, you need the Germans, and maybe even if Hitler has controls that power, you need them to prevent communists for taking over Europe. Communists at that point in Europe were the Soviet Union. So he justified his inaction. He disagreed with Hitler, but not joining hands against Hitler with the Allies. He said, first of all, his justification were not joining Axis, that he didn't like Hitler's kind of racism and deification of any one community. And on the other hand, he did not join the Allies because he would rather have the Germans stopping the Soviet communist power. So he stayed out of that war. Clever fellow. And the Allies also didn't push him because they thought that if they pushed him too much, there might be a reaction also in Spain. And that may push Spain on the side of the Germans, and Spain is a large European country as well. And that is how he survived the post-Second World War wave of decolonization and also opprobrium over fascism of any kind, because he had very cleverly stayed out of it. So Salazar ruled Portugal from 1932 to 1968. In fact, even in 1968, when he gave up power, he was alive for 2 more years after that. His people were still in control, and it wasn't until 4 years after his death, 1974, that there was what is called as a Carnation Revolution in Portugal. So the army had a coup. It was a bloodless coup. People came out in support of the coup to get rid of this fascist dictatorship. And because famously one restaurant waiter had gone around handing carnations to the troops who had come out, this got the name Carnation Revolution. Some of these revolutions get nice names like that. I mean, incidentally, what happened in Czechoslovakia at the end of the Cold War was also called Velvet Revolutions. This was the Carnation Revolution of 1974. Now we are leapfrogging time epochs a little bit, but 1974 was the first time, once the fascists lost power in Portugal, that Portugal recognized Goa as a part of India. And the new leader of Portugal said that the past leaders had made mistakes. And after that, India and Portugal established full diplomatic relations. 1990, India's president made the first high-level Indian visit to Portugal. And 1992 or 93, 92, I think, the Portuguese chief executive, the Portuguese Prime Minister Soares came to India. So this was a big, complicated situation. Now, if you think this is complicated, and why am I talking Salazar? Now, Salazar is somebody who's imprinted on our memories of people like me who are children of the 60s, because the first of our wars in the decade of the 60s was the war over Goa. It wasn't a very intense war. As I told you earlier, it was over in 26 hours. Indian armed forces lost 22 lives. The Portuguese armed forces lost 30 lives. And the matter was then settled. For a little while, an army general was made administrator of Goa. He was then Major General K.P. Kendeth. He became somewhat more famous subsequently in 1971 war when he was commanding our Western Command. So it was a 26-hour war, but it was still frozen, still imprinted on our minds. And we also remember that in 1964-65, there was a famous film, a big hit at that point, a big bit of a caper, typical I.S. Jawhar Mahmood comedy caper called Jawhar Mahmood in Goa. Check it out. And that had many hit songs which even now endure. And it was based on the liberation movement within Goa. And that had one stanza which sticks to my mind even now. And that was, Halaku raha hai na Hitler raha hai, Mussolini ka na Lashkar. So all the tyrants were listed. Halaku, by the way, is Gulag Khan, one among the many members of the progeny of Genghis Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan. So Gulag Khan. So it says, Halaku raha hai na Hitler raha hai, Mussolini ka na Lashkar raha hai, raha nahi jab Rus ka zar baki. So Halaku has faded away, Hitler has faded away, Mussolini has been destroyed. Raha nahi jab Rus ka Tsar baki. In Russia also the Tsar has not survived. तो कैसे रहेगा Salazar baki? So Salazar is a name that remains imprinted on the memory of my generation, and not for no reason, because he was the longest lasting dictator in the Western world, 1932 to 1968, and incidentally, he was born in the same year as Jawaharlal Nehru in 1889. Now, Salazar was somebody who wasn't going to give up, and as you can see, he had a survival instinct. So he was able to ride out the Second World War in Europe completely unmolested, and also keep his fascism and his dictatorship, which is described as a kind of corporate authoritarianism. So he combined nationalism, capitalism, all kinds of interesting ideas. The basic purpose was to perpetuate his power forever. He contested elections. No surprise, he was so popular, he kept on getting 100% votes. What I'm trying to say. So he knew that the world war is over. The world war is over. How is he going to manage in the new world, which did not like dictators, which did not like fascists, particularly in Europe? So he bent over backwards and joined NATO. So 1949, as NATO came up, he became a member of NATO. Now, the NATO treaty says that NATO is responsible for the defense of all the territories of its member states. Remember, NATO was careful to say that they are not responsible for the defense of the colonies of their member states. So they said they are responsible for the defense of the territories of their member states. But Portugal, meanwhile, Salazar had rewritten his constitution in a way that all his overseas colonies were now called integral parts of the Portuguese territory. So Goa in particular was described now in his constitution as Goan territory. And that is what applied to NATO also. So if there was a military intervention in the 50s or at any point by India, NATO would have had to come to Portugal's defense in Goa. And no Indian government wanted to, at that point, lock horns with NATO. Again, I'll take you back to early 50s. Now, NATO comes up in 1949. Right? India, Pakistan really become independent by around 1950-51, when all the major British officials have gone. They have their own army chiefs. India has its own constitution. 1950, 51, 52, that is the period. 52, India has the first election. 53, Pakistan signs the first of the US-led security treaties. So Seato, CENTO, Pakistan signed between 53 and 54. So now India is looking at a situation where the French are still sitting in Pondicherry, right? And India is negotiating with them. Portugal says Goa is an integral part of Portugal. It's not a colony. NATO accepts that in principle. Pakistan is indirectly a member of NATO in the sense that it's a member of other America-led security military alliances in Asia. Pakistan, Thailand, and the Philippines were the three members from Asia in these alliances. So in that situation, for India to go headlong and fight with NATO and risk fighting with NATO in Goa was problematic. And by mid-50s, India began to get into trouble with the Chinese as well. So how do we understand more about this? As I was reading up, I found one good thing the Americans do is they declassify their documents. They don't just declassify them, they also edit them and they also publish them. So while reading this up, I found the account of a meeting on November 30, 1955 between Dr. Paulo Cunha, who was the Portuguese foreign minister. He was visiting Washington and he was meeting John Foster Dulles, the legendary, famous, infamous, depending on which side you are on, US Secretary of State. He of the fame that Churchill once described as a bull who carries his own china shop. That is a line that we use very often in the context of many other people, particularly lately for Navjot Singh Sidhu in Punjab. But Churchill had also called him dull, duller, dullest. So you can see that John Foster Dulles was a polarizing figure. Now, minutes of this meeting have been published by the US State Department, and I will share that link with you. You can read the entire minutes. And the minutes say that the visiting Portuguese foreign minister began the conversation with his American counterpart by talking about Goa first. And he said that India is making unnecessary noises about Goa. Goa is an integral part of Portugal. It is not a colony. And he was very upset that Khrushchev and Bulganin had come to India and they had declared Portuguese to be blood-sucking colonialists, and they had, in his view, instigated India to use force against Portuguese occupation or Portuguese rule in Goa. He also claimed that a majority of the Goans were actually keen to stay on with Portugal and not go to India. So at one point in that conversation, Dulles actually suggests to Kunna that why don't you hold a plebiscite in Goa? And he said, what will the plebiscite achieve? He says, look, I'm not suggesting it. It's just an idea I'm floating. Because in America, a lot of people are influenced by Nehru, and they believe that you should not be holding a little bit of territory on the Indian subcontinent. You should hand it back to India. But if you hold a plebiscite, this is what the American Secretary of State is suggesting to his Portuguese counterpart on 30th November 1955. And he says, if you can hold a plebiscite, and the plebiscite says that people want to stay with you, then it will help build public opinion in America. So the Portuguese foreign minister said, oh, come on. Suppose I tell you to hold a plebiscite in Florida or Massachusetts or say Alaska. You don't. You won't give your people the option of either staying with you or going somewhere. So this is our territory as much as, say, Florida or Alaska or Massachusetts is a part of United States of America. At that point, Dulles instigates him further. And he says, even if you don't want to do it, why don't you go to when you speak at the National Press Association in your address, mention that you are open to the idea of the plebiscite. And the Portuguese foreign minister says, but Nehru has said that even if a plebiscite shows that people say they want to be with Portugal, he will not accept it. But Dulles says, still you say it, at least he's suggesting that it will create some kind of a positive climate for Portuguese claims. So till 1950s, you can see that the Western world is fully with Portugal. And here, Pakistan is obviously coming out in Portugal's support, and that's another nexus that's building up, and we'll come to that in a minute. 1956, Dulles made a statement. Which got India furious. It got India so furious that not just the Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, but even the Indian President at that point made statements saying that this was an outrageous statement and should never have been made. So Dulles said in his statement that Goa is an integral part of Portugal. Now you know the implications. If the US says Goa is an integral part of Portugal, US is the leader of NATO. Portugal is a member of NATO. NATO is treaty bound to defend all territory of all its member states. You can see where the line is drawn. In fact, later when Nehru met Eisenhower, some of this came up. But once again, that is something on which the Americans were willing to say. In fact, when all this protest came from India, even then Dulles said, I was just making this statement to push all sides towards a negotiated settlement, so there is no use of force. And then something changed in America. What changed? John F. Kennedy got elected. As he got elected, he made some statements which seemed to show more understanding of India's case or India's cause on Goa. By that time, a lot of Indian freedom movements, Goan freedom movements, had started. In fact, the history of freedom movements in Goa is very old. The first one actually goes back to 1787. That is called the Pinto conspiracy. This was a bunch of pastors, all from a Pinto family in Candolim village, who actually conspired with Tipu Sultan to overthrow the Portuguese. Maybe they just wanted to, in the process, get control of the place for themselves. So that was the first one, and they were caught and punished very severely. You can imagine 18th century European colonialists' punishment. So that was one. Then another big modern freedom movement began in 1900 or so. 1900 or so, Goa saw its first newspaper formed. And this newspaper, O Heraldo, became the first Portuguese language newspaper in India that began to publish in 1900. It was founded by Luis de Menezes Braganza. So you can count him among the first Portuguese freedom fighters. Not the only one, but among the first. That paper became very critical of the Portuguese and very critical of the colonial rule. So in 1917, the Portuguese imposed censorship, took away all the liberties, and then they followed a system that whatever liberties people might have had in Portugal, they did not have in Goa. So while on the one hand they said this is an integral part of Portugal, this is not a colony, but they used colonial powers in Goa. So that started a movement and that carried on. And 1928 is when Tristão de Bragança Cunha founded the Congress Party in Goa. And that is when one thing led to another. Now, while Nehru was being patient, you might say pacifist and you might find fault in this. But I've told you what exactly was happening. Changeover in America took place. As the changeover in America took place, Kennedy used softer language about Goa, although Kennedy was still leaning on Nehru not to use force. There was also an Afro-Asian conference in Delhi where a lot of Afro-Asian leaders actually questioned India that why are you allowing a colonial power to stay on your mainland? So Nehru had come under pressure there also. But Kennedy was still pushing him not to use force. So December 16, John Kenneth Galbraith delivered a letter to Nehru from Kennedy requesting him not to use force. And Nehru wrote a reply the same day, which was to be delivered to Kennedy, saying that, look, I'm willing to put off my operations by 6 months to give you time for a negotiated settlement. The rest is history. The very next morning, Indian Armed Forces moved into Goa and it was all over in 26 hours. So that is what happened. Now, what was happening meanwhile? Narendra Modi said in his speech that even while our freedom fighters were being fired at, were suffering atrocities by the Portuguese, and they were requesting Government of India's intervention, armed intervention, Nehru did not do so. Now, factually, that point is correct. Because at various points of time, many Indian political groups, particularly the socialists, it was Ram Manohar Lohia, first of all, who was a nationalist before he was a socialist, who began pressing for an early liberation of Goa. And Socialist Party, or then the different factions of Socialist Party, they were sending satyagrahis into Goa, and the Portuguese police and the army were using very, very draconian methods to contain them. In fact, at one point, the Praja Socialist Party leader, N.G. Gore, he also led a satyagrahi group into Goa. They were taken prisoner and he spent 20 months in Fort Aguada jail. Fort Aguada is where now the Taj resort is located in Goa. So he spent 20 months in that jail. So many of these satyagrahis were going. There was also some bit of an armed insurgency, some bombings, etc., etc. But Nehru was disapproving of this. Because Nehru said, at one point, Nehru also said, again, history can judge him in terms of whether he was being wise, he was being cowardly, he was being patient, he was just holding his fire, he was being silly. That is not a judgment for us to make. History will make that judgment. We just have to put out all the facts in front of you. Nehru also said at one point that these satyagrahis want to force my hand, to use force, to use armed forces. I'm not going to do that. I'll bide my time. He didn't say I'll bide my time, but he was biding his time. And that time came under Kennedy's rule. So December 17, 1961, he sent his forces in. So those forces were led by, I told you, General Kandeth was there, Brigadier Sagat Singh was there. These are all the famous names of Indian Army going ahead. And General Chaudhry, J.N. Chaudhry, was then heading the Southern Command. He later became the army chief. And you know what this operation was called? It was called Operation Vijay. You saw that code name used again in the operations at Kargil. Now, as you start reading up on history, contemporary history, or maybe start revisiting some, you also make some interesting discoveries and rediscoveries. So reading up on these American declassified documents, I also find this note from John Foster Dulles, written to the president after his meeting with Nehru. And somewhere there he says that this was a very good meeting. We really put our hair down, his line, not my line. And he also says, I was amused that towards the end of the conference, Nehru was sitting on the back of the sofa with his feet on the seat, right? So it also tells you that great leaders, controversial, weak, strong, whatever, they also have a human side to them. And we have to be at least grateful to those who put some of these things on record so we can refer to these and we can also visualize meetings like that. So I will also share a screenshot of this note with you.